Okay, and we are live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reedsy Live. Reedsy's ongoing series of webinars where we bring on professionals from the world of publishing to show you how to write and publish better books. My name is Martin. I'm part of the team here at Reedsy. I'm based in London, but Reedsy, like our fair audience, is spotted all over the world. So before we bring on our guest, please let me know who you are, where you're coming from, and what sort of stuff you're working on. We'll get a little bit of a chat before we go. But today's one is going to be a good one. We're going to be talking about shutting out one's inner critic and writing a zero draft, which is a phrase that's new to me but makes absolute sense when I first hear it. So let's have a look who's here. We've got Diane from Chicago. Fantastic. We've got Jean from Lakewood, Colorado. We've got Alfreda from New York. Carol from Monterey Bay, California. Wonderful. Let's scroll a bit up, see who else. Joseph from El Paso. So that's Texas there. Andy Shaw from Dallas, another Texas. Chris Matthew from Somerset, here in the bleak UK where I am, and where spring has been threatening to spring for quite a while, yet has yet to be sprung. But any day now. We've got Julia from Ireland. Hello, hello. Dee Ann Harper from BC, Canada, and Riz from Denver. Wonderful. Always good to see a good international crowd. I know this time isn't exactly convenient for a lot of folks, but I'm very pleased that you could join us for this one today. It's a fabulous writing one, talking about that all-important step of drafting, getting that first draft written, which I know for a lot of folks, myself included, is often the hardest part. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes. We haven't quite hit the hour, but for just a bit of housekeeping. It really helps us when you like and subscribe to our channel in this video, so even though we haven't started yet, a preemptive thumbs up will mean a lot to me. Help this get seen by more people. Also, throughout this presentation, there are going to be people in the comments asking some questions to save me from having to dig around for them. If someone asks, will this be replayed later? Yes, here on YouTube. You can come back to this page and rewatch it at any point you like. We will also be doing a transcript of this, so if there's any bit you feel like you've missed, or if we're talking too quickly, as I want to, there will be a transcript of this we'll do in the next few days. If you go to the Reedsy Live website, you'll find all the webinars we've ever done, along with transcripts. So most of them, apart from the ones that I've forgotten to do. There are a few in there, so consider them Easter eggs. You can hunt through the weeks where I was just a bit too busy. But let's see who else is here. Patsy Quinn from Yorkshire. We have Catherine from Surrey here in the UK. Margit or Margie from Las Vegas, Nevada. Wonderful. Peter from Southport, Maine. Jade Garden Talks from Connecticut. Wonderful. Lots of coastal folks. Oh, and someone from Ottawa. Not so coastal. So, yeah, we're just going to start in just a minute. Thank you, everyone who's given us a thumbs up so far. If you subscribe to this channel, you'll be the first one to know whenever we have a new one of these scheduled. We also have great new content that comes out every single week. We have a YouTuber, Shaylin, who she's a writer in her own right, but she puts together lots of great content about writing, about editing, about publishing in general. It's well worth a watch. So, I'm noticing it is now 8 o'clock here in the UK. So that means it's 3 p.m. on the East Coast, noon on the West Coast, I think 12:30 in India, and much, much earlier in Hong Kong, Singapore, New Zealand, Australia. Anyone who's joining us from that far flung, please have my gratitude forever. But let me bring on my guest, if we are ready. My guest today is the international best-selling author of Before I Go to Sleep, Second Life, and Final Cut. He's now embarking on a public novel writing project called The Experiment, which you can follow on his Substack. Please welcome S.J. Watson. Hello, Steve. How are you?
Hi, Martin. Thank you for having me again. It's great to be here.
I know,
And with such an international audience as well. I forget every time. I'm expecting to be sort of Pam from Hartlepool and Dave from Scunthorpe, but no, it's all very exotic.
Oh, yeah. Are you always imagining this is like a sort of after hours at a Blackwell's or a Waterstones?
Yeah,
Just
yeah, and it's like noon for many of the viewers. So hello, I'm glad you're giving up your lunch break to. I hope I'm good.
yeah, it's always an odd time because I think some folks is dead in the middle of the afternoon. This, I only choose this time because it's after my dinner or before my dinner if I'm having. Those early days where I thought, no, wouldn't it be nice to do this in the evening for the American crowd? which led me to like
Yeah.
wake up at 1 in the morning to do this, and I'm never doing that one again. So I appreciate everyone fitting around my personal schedule.
And mine as well.
Oh yeah,
It's good
it's
for
good
me.
for us folks here in Europe. So yeah, Steve, since you joined us for a webinar at the end of last year, I think we were talking about deciding whether your idea is a good idea, and
Mm.
from what I understand, you are on the cusp of a good idea yourself.
Well, that remains to be seen. There's a reason it's called the experiment. We'll see.
Will you talk about that in your presentation, or do you want to chat a second
Yeah,
about that?
I think it kind of hopefully it will tie in. So yeah, I'll be talking a little bit about that.
Okay, great. Well, let's see how many people we have right now with us. 762, and yet only 179 likes. Perhaps we have to entice them with some quality content before we can get that number up. Um, all right, I know you have a lot to talk about, Steve, so I'm going to disappear behind the curtains. I'll be watching. If you need anything, just let me know. Folks watching
Cool.
at home, we're going to have a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, I'll try to keep an eye on that and pin them and bring them back later. But if we don't get to them, remember to ask them again at the end. All right, Steve, I'll see you in a bit.
Cool. Thank you very much. Well, hi everybody. So today I'm going to be talking about how to write a draft zero and silence your inner editor. And it was interesting what Martin said about it never having heard it called draft zero before, because it's also a relatively new phrase to me. So I thought what I would do is kick off by discussing what I mean by draft zero. And then we'll talk a little bit about why we need this thing that I'm going to refer to as draft zero. And of course, other people call it different things. Most notably, probably many people, if not most, probably call it the first draft or draft one. But there's a reason I call it draft zero. So I'll be talking a little bit about why I think it's an important thing. And then it all kind of leads into each other. But the third thing I'll spend a little bit of time discussing is why I think it's incredibly important, and this is something that I only realised relatively late on in my when I was a fledgling writer, when I was an aspiring novelist. It was fairly late thing I realised this, and it made a huge difference to me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why it's really important to separate the editing stage of the work from the writing stage, and to be when you sit down at the desk in the morning or afternoon or evening or whenever it might be, but when you sit down at the desk to write, or to work rather, to be very conscious of whether you're planning to write or to edit, because I think that's a very important distinction to make. And then the final thing, which hopefully we'll get onto, I do want to leave time for questions, because obviously I think that's very important, but we'll talk about a little bit about why I think it's really, really important to give yourself permission to write badly. As Martin said at the top, a lot of this stuff I talk about in my Substack newsletter, which is sjwatson.substack.com. So do sign up to that. And it also ties in a little bit with a new project that Martin also mentioned called The Experiment. And I was kind of joking about there being a reason it's called The Experiment. I don't know how it's going to go, basically, but really what that is I've just started it this week. In fact, it's an attempt to try and put my money where my mouth is, in a way. And so the things I talk about, especially around this issue of editing and writing, I wanted to sort of basically write a novel in public. So the idea is that I'm going to be writing my first draft, my draft zero, but sharing it. And the reason I'm slightly anxious about this is because the one thing I will say at the top is, the one thing I recommend is that you don't share your draft zero with anybody. You have to write it with a freedom that can only come from knowing that no one is ever going to see it and no one is ever going to read it. But I want to really show people that when I say you have to give yourself permission to do bad writing, that's exactly what I mean. I'm going to share my bad writing, essentially, just to show that I'm no different to everybody else. Just because I've been in the Sunday Times and the New York Times bestseller list, it doesn't mean that my first drafts land on the page perfectly formed. So that's why I'm sharing basically week by week, or fortnight by fortnight, more likely, a chapter at a time, a book that I'm writing in real time with input from you, the audience. So anyway, so that's what the experiment is, and hopefully that will give you a bit of context and background, or rather support the talk I'm about to give. But let's dive into it. So first of all, if we just talk, I'm scrolling up my notes, which are on my screen. If we talk about what we mean by draft zero, what I mean by draft zero, isn't draft zero basically just draft one? That's the question, I suppose. And it can be. I mean, you can call it what you like. But for me, probably fairly self-explanatory, draft zero is the first words you put on the page when trying to tell your story, basically. And by words on the page, I suppose I don't mean the plan. I mean the first attempt at writing the story itself. And the way that really we can sort of think about this is a draft zero, in a way, is somewhere between an outline and a first draft. If you talk about if you think of an outline as being a plan, a scene-by-scene breakdown, or even just vague notes about where you think the story's going to go. As I'm sure we can all agree, plans can be of varying length, varying complexity. Some people don't have a plan at all, and they're completely what they call pants the book. They just write with no real idea where it's going to go. Other people have quite lengthy plans. It can be a series of bullet points. I know one very successful multi-best-selling author who told me that she writes 90-page plans for each of her books, which, and the books are only 300 pages or something like that. So the plan is a third of the length of the book. So it really can vary hugely what you would call the outline or the plan of the book. And then the first draft would, in my formulation of it anyway, will tend to have all of the basic elements in place. So there'll be an attempt at making the writing good, not as good as it can be, perhaps not as good as it will be by the time that you've been through the complete drafting process, but there'll be an attempt there at doing good writing, even though it probably does need some restructuring and some revision. And I think, but between those two extremes, between a very rough outline and a well-written or an attempt at a well-written draft, you've got draft zero. So for some people, a draft zero is very rough. It's not really much more than an extended outline, but it will contain, unlike an outline necessarily, it will contain scenes, breaks, dialogue, description. So, it will kind of flow and tell the story. It just might not be very good. So, for example, a draft zero will contain typos, it contain cliche, things that, crucially, I think, even as you're writing them down, even as you're typing them onto the screen or writing them in your notebook, these things will probably, or almost certainly will be changed, but you write them anyway, rather than stopping then and there and changing them in an attempt to make it a polished draft. So draft zero is kind of a less polished first draft, or an unpolished first draft, if you like. And for me, that's the big distinction, is that draft zero will contain lots of things that even as you write them, they're going to change. So my draft zero, for example, it's actually we'll see when I start posting it next week, but it's reasonably polished. So there's an attempt there at decent writing, but it will definitely contain things that I'm not sure about yet, that I think will have to change, that I know is a tired, cliched phrase that I don't want to include in the final draft. And crucially for me, it'll also contain endless notes to self. So I'll use usually square brackets, sometimes asterisks, sometimes just capitalize or highlight, and just make a note, something like, this will need to be developed later. This character's was called Dave or should be called, but there'll be things that I just that are occurring to me as I write, that I'll make a note that maybe I need to go back and change, or I need to remember to pick up in future writing sessions. So why do we call it a draft zero? Why not just call that a draft one and say the draft one is really rough, and then draft two starts to get a bit better, and draft three and draft four are improving? I personally call it draft zero because for me, it's a way that I trick my brain, if you like, into believing that this stuff doesn't matter. Because I think that's one of the most crucial things about this initial draft of a book. It's just getting the words onto the page so you can then fix them. Um, it's a cliched thing to say that a blank page is scary, but it kind of is. So I think if you can get some words on a page, even if they're not very good ones, and even if they don't read, even if as you write them, they're not going to end up in a finished book or a finished story or a finished draft even. Uh, the page becomes less scary. It's got stuff on it. It's not blank anymore. I liken it. I like to think of it as being a little bit like. I don't paint, so I'm probably talking utter rubbish there. So anyone out there who does paint can correct me if they like. But it's a little bit like an artist would stretch their canvas or would mix their paints before they start. To paint their masterpiece. And I think it's the same for me for the draft zero. The draft zero for me is just getting things ready. It's just getting my material together. So as I say, the crucial thing that I would like you to take away from this talk about draft zero is that no one should see it. You should write it knowing that no one is going to ever see it. So you can be as bad, as terrible as you like. You can write ridiculous notes to self. That knowing that no one is ever going to see them. So as I said before, that's why the experiment feels like a very scary thing for me, because I'm going to let people see it. But I'm hoping that people will get something from that. Other people have different tricks in order to trick themselves or to convince themselves that this is not an important draft. It's very free flowing. I know, for example, that DBC Pierre, who wrote a book called Vernon God Little, which won the Booker Prize. I know that he writes his initial draft. I don't know if he calls it draft zero or draft one, I'm not sure, but he writes his initial draft under a different name. So he creates a document with a different author name as a way of convincing or tricking himself into thinking it's nothing to do with him. So whatever works for you is a good, whatever works for you works, in order to give yourself that freedom, basically, to write freely and without fear of judgment. Because let's face it, as authors, we judge ourselves harshly enough. So it's a good idea to not encourage judgment from other people. So the second thing I wanted to move on to was, why do we need to create this draft zero? Why is it kind of so important? And this ties in really with this distinction to be made between separating the writing from the editing. If we think about, crucially, writing and editing use different parts of the brain. You may know some of this. I'm not a neuropsychologist. I'm not an expert in any of this from a medical or a psychological point of view. But writing and editing use very different parts of the brain. And what we want to do when we're writing is tell the story, get the story out. And I think, for me anyway, the holy grail of that is when we can get into what's called flow. Now, you probably all have an idea of what we mean by flow, but I like to think of it as, some people call it being in the zone. And I think hopefully we've all experienced it at one time or another. But for me, it's when you become fully immersed in an activity. And obviously we're talking about writing now. So it's when I become fully immersed in the writing, the work that I'm doing. I'm not noticing distractions. And sometimes and for me, it's I think for most people, it's a difficult thing to do. It's a difficult state to achieve, of truly being in the zone. But when you do get there, it's a great feeling when you realise that you've just spent 90 minutes and not really looked up from your notepad or your computer, and you just haven't really noticed the passing of time. It's that feeling that every action and thought seems to flow, which is why it's called flow, I suppose, but it seems to flow very effortlessly from the previous one without very much conscious brain. Of course, we are using our brains. We're using, in many ways, to a maximum, capability, but it doesn't feel so conscious. It's a much more subconscious process. And it strikes me sometimes. This is when people talk about the muse, and when they feel. I think when writing is, for me anyway, is going very well, it almost feels as though the story exists out there in the ether, and I'm just the conduit. I'm just the way that it's. I'm giving it form, but I'm not actually inventing it. Of course, that's not true. But that's when you're really in flow. That's the state that we're trying to achieve, when it just feels as though it's flooding out of us. And we're almost, the story is coming almost quicker than we can type or we can write. So I think that's when we're really being creative. And I think when you're in that state, or I certainly find when I'm in that state of flow, that's when I will find surprising things happening with the work. So the brain will throw things up that I perhaps hadn't been anticipating. It's when I'm most likely to deviate from any plan that I've written, for example. It's when the work starts to surprise me. In my first book, Before I Go to Sleep, I remember there being an entire, and also actually in the one it's just happened again, in the one I've just finished, a whole plot twist or a whole plot arc just have come from nowhere. Something I wasn't anticipating just suddenly was there on the page, and which that's a wonderful feeling when that does happen, and that's what we're trying to do. But that only happens when the area of our brain called the prefrontal cortex is less engaged. And I'm having to look at my notes now to get the words right. But the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that takes care of the higher cognitive processes. And these include things like self-reflection and analytical thinking. So you can probably see where this is going. We need to disengage the prefrontal cortex in order to be able to enter this state of flow. And that means disengaging the parts of our brain that are analysing, that are doing that kind of more analytical assessment of the work or of the thing that we're doing. So to oversimplify, we can really think of it in a way that the left hemisphere of the brain, the left-hand side of the brain, is the logical, and the right is the more creative part of the brain. So you can think of it in terms of being the left is for editing and the right is for creating. And although we can switch between left and right relatively easily, we do it all the time, obviously, in our day-to-day lives. But when you are working, switching between left brain to right brain, so creating to editing, editing back to creating, does slow us down. And one analogy that I really like is it's a little bit like trying to drive a car with one foot on the, well, we'd say accelerator, but for my international audience, I'll say gas, with one foot on the gas pedal and the other foot on the brake. We are trying to move forward and at the same time trying to slow down, which is obviously not going to be very helpful. And we decrease or even reduce to zero in many ways, I think, our chance of ever reaching that state of flow, which is what we're really trying to get into. So as you can probably see from what I've said so far, probably tell, what I'm really saying is this draft zero is something that we want to create, even though it probably will contain lots and lots of bad writing. And one of the things I truly believe is you have got to give yourself permission to write badly. I think we should be striving to write well. If you've got a great idea and a great image in your head, you should be even in your draft zero, you should be trying to write it as well as you can. But if that's not happening and it doesn't really seem to be going that well, and you don't feel particularly comfortable with the work you're doing, even as you're writing, you're thinking, "Oh, this isn't very good. This isn't very good." Stick with it. Resist the effort to stop, to switch brain hemispheres, to go into analytical mode, to start correcting things, moving things around, to think too deeply about what you're doing, because that's going to decrease your chance of reaching that point where it starts to flow seemingly effortlessly. And I think it's worth remembering I think there is something, I don't know if you could say it's unique, but it's certainly a rare thing about novels and books and stories, because this applies to short stories as well. It's not just about long pieces of fiction. When you read, or actually it applies to non-fiction too, so it applies to all writing. When you read something, a piece of writing, a piece of work which is moves you, or you think is brilliant, or just feels perfect in some way, someone else's work, I mean, now when you're reading a novel or whatever. Unlike when you look at a painting, I think when you look at a painting, when you listen to a piece of music, you can, in a way, you can hear the effort, or you can see the effort. You can see the detail of the brushstrokes, or you can hear the way that the chords move together. And with almost any other piece of art or piece of creative work, I think you can, when you experience the work, you also are very aware of the effort and time and energy that's gone into it, and the skill that it's taken to produce that thing. Whereas I think it's slightly different with writing, because when you read a piece of writing that moves you, or that seems to create an image in your head, I think when it's good, it feels like there is no other way that piece, that image, or that thought, or that idea has ever been expressed, or could ever be expressed. So the irony, I think, that the tricky thing is that when you read a great book, or read a great story, or read a great essay, it feels like it's a first draft. It feels like it just fell out of Stephen King's head onto the page, or Margaret Atwood, or whoever you happen to, admire. But it just feels like that is a first draft. And I think it's a really, really crucial thing to remember, that I would probably go out on a limb and say nothing we read is ever a first draft. Nothing we read is the first draft. I don't think anyone, even people who say their first drafts are very clean and very, they still need polishing, they still need editing. They'll still be, at the very least, there'll be typos, but more likely there'll be cliches, or more obvious mistakes, or that need to be taken out and just reworked and revised and polished. So just remember that when you read something that's been published in whatever form, it's never a first draft. It's always been edited. And probably in many cases, the initial draft of it was not very good. So books are made in the edit. Stories are made in the edit. That's when the raw material becomes good, becomes its final, or approaches its final form. How you go about this, is up to you, and different people do different things. Some people will write a whole draft zero. They might, as in from the beginning to the end, and then begin to revise and polish and edit the whole thing. So I know some people's draft zeros, for example, are a third of the length of the final book, because they skim things that they're not quite sure about yet. They don't put as much description in as they might ultimately, or some of the dialogue might not be there at all. It might just, I know one author in particular who if she hits a stage in her book when two characters have to, for example, have an argument, she'll just write big argument here, knowing that means that she can get on with telling the story, and then in the second draft, in the next draft, can flesh out that argument when she knows their characters a little bit better. So whatever works for you works. So some people will write a whole draft and then edit the thing. Other people might write a draft zero of chapter 1 and then edit chapter 1, and then when chapter 1 feels that it's done, then write a draft zero of chapter 2 and then edit chapter 2, and so on. So it's really, or a section by section, or 50 pages by 50 pages, whatever works for you. But the crucial thing in all of this, I think, is not to try and write and edit in the same session. I think if you're writing, get the ideas out, get the words onto the page. I'm not saying rush it. I'm not saying type as quickly as you can. I'm saying type as quickly as you need to, I think. And so even if as you're typing you're aware that the line you just typed really doesn't belong there, it belongs at the beginning of the paragraph, or even the scene that you're in the middle of typing actually should have happened 3,000 words ago, don't move it then. Resist the temptation to move the chapter, to move the scene, or to move the line, or even to move the word then. Some people, I find it, I'm going to be very honest with you, I find it difficult to do this. But if you can do this, I wouldn't even correct typos. I type quite quickly. I made the mistake. Well, it's not a mistake. I taught myself to touch type with all 10 fingers, but I don't do it very well, which means I type quickly but badly. But and I find it hard not to go back and retype the word so it's spelt correctly. But if you can do that, fine, that's fine. As long as you can read it, as long as you, when you come to, I didn't know what word you meant, it doesn't really matter. Just push on. Because I think as well at this point, the crucial thing is also to be enjoying it. Writing is hard, but it's also supposed to be fun at least some of the time. So I think if you can get into flow and lose yourself in the story that you're writing, who cares if you've misspelt a word here or there, or if you've used a cliche when something else could be better. If you can just tell the story and get the words down, that's great. Something I constantly reminding myself is that a page of bad writing, if you don't take anything else from this part of my talk, just remember a page of bad writing is better than 100 pages of no writing. So you can work with a page of really rubbish, whereas if you've got nothing, you've got nothing. You're starting from scratch. So do give yourself permission to write really badly. I also wanted to talk about things that you can do if you feel that the work is straying off course a little bit. If you're struggling to get into the flow, if you're losing your enthusiasm for the work, we all go through stages where just dragging ourselves to the desk or to the notepad or whatever feels like a bit of an effort and we'd rather be doing anything else. But I think if you're going through a prolonged period of time where you're just not feeling it, it can be a good idea to take a step back and look at why that might be. Sometimes it's just because you're in the middle of a book. I said this before, but I think what can often happen is when you've just started a project, especially if it's a novel length piece of work, when you've just started something new, it feels exciting. The ideas are there. You can't wait to get them down. So it can be easier to get into that stage of flow. It can be easier to switch off your inner editor. And at the end, you're often thinking, right, I'm nearly done, and you've got that renewed burst of enthusiasm. But if you're in the middle, it can be a bit sludgy. I call it the sludgy middle bit, which is not particularly poetic, but I think it creates the right image for me of just, it could just be that you're stuck in the middle. But if something isn't right, if the work is resisting, if you're struggling to get into flow, if you're struggling to switch off the editor, maybe something isn't right. Maybe it's the work telling you that something isn't right. So I would say there are a few things you can do. Go back to where you felt that the work was flowing, where you felt it was easier to achieve that state of flow. And often deep down, where you went wrong. You might not want to admit it to yourself. It might be difficult to pinpoint exactly, but deep down, you often will know more or less where you took a wrong turn. And so start again from there, or go back to there at least. And often I find it really helpful to just free write for a bit, to write about why I feel I'm stuck, what seems to be happening, why I am reluctant to pick up my pen. And often that can free something, if you excuse the cliche, but that can free, by free writing, you can unlock something. But crucially, I think it's a really good idea sometimes to just get away from the desk. When I'm struggling, I very rarely have a breakthrough while I'm sat at my desk. It's when I've given up and I'm washing up or walking the dog or cooking or something. That's when the answer to my question will come to me. And And I think if you can do something that's creative and absorbing, so something that does occupy your brain, but it's very different from the work you're doing. So you're not thinking about the characters you're writing about. You're not thinking about the plot point that you're stuck on. You're doing something very different. That can help you to really switch off that editor. Because the editor, let's face it, is the part of your brain that's going, this isn't very good. You need to do better. And if you can, that's the part of the brain that you need to switch off. I've got a few more minutes before questions. So the last thing I'm just going to talk about is about some practical ways that you can, if you're struggling to write and not edit, if you're struggling to get into the zone where you're just, or to get into flow where you're just creating and not editing, some practical tips that I've come across, some of which I use myself, many of which I use myself actually, that can just help you to remain within the writing side of the brain, which is the left, I think, but I'm sure someone will correct me if I've got that wrong. No, it's the right hand side, isn't it? The creative side of the brain is the right hand side, and how do we stay in that? How can we stop ourselves from being tempted to edit as we go, which is what we shouldn't be doing. There is a program, I think it's called Write or Die, but there is a program which I've used in the past where basically, and I think this is a bit hardcore, but I didn't use it for very long, but I think it gives you the idea of, at least, of what we're trying to achieve here. It's software which would start to delete words at the big, if you leave too long a gap when you're not writing something. So if you leave too long a gap between writing two words, it'll delete a word from the beginning of the piece that you're writing. So it's a bit brutal, but it does force you. It's the equivalent of forcing you to keep your pen in contact with the page, and to be continually writing words. So that's one quite extreme method, but there are others that I've also found a little bit less scary, because that can actually put me in a state of panic almost, with this need to write my next word before I lose one. It sounds very strange, but I do often, well, there are two things. And the first is I switch my screen off. So especially if you use an external monitor with a laptop, it can be very helpful. But basically, or turn the brightness right down. So either switch the screen off or turn the brightness down. And that then means you literally can't see what you're writing. So you don't know you've just typed, you've just misspelt the word particular or whatever. It forces you to just push on. You can't look back and go, well, actually that paragraph should be up the top there, and this paragraph, which was at the beginning, should be at the bottom, and so on. You can't do that because you can't see it. It forces you to remain in that creative mindset of just getting words out there. So it sounds a strange thing, but it can be really helpful to either switch your screen off or turn the brightness right down so you can't see what you're doing. And similar, if not perhaps quite as hardcore or as brutal as that, I quite often just make the text huge. So with whatever program you're using, whether you're using Scrivener or Word or whatever you might be using, but just make the text, like, I'm not talking about quite big, I mean like huge. So it's almost filling the screen. And that's just another way that it forces you to focus solely on the words that you're writing, because you can't look back easily anyway. You can't easily look back and see what you wrote a paragraph ago, which obviously when you're editing would be a terrible position to be in. But when you're writing, that's the ideal position to be in, when you're not looking and analysing where you've been, you're just concentrating on pushing forward. So switching the screen off or making the text very large can help. There are two other things that I can recommend. I use focus quite a lot, which I think, there are lots of different. It depends on whether you're. I use a lot of Apple products, and so they have this thing called Focus now. But essentially, it's just a way that you are blocking distractions. So this is slightly different because it's not so much about keeping the editing brain at bay. It's really about keeping all distractions at bay. But a focus or whatever the equivalent is on whatever system you use, just a way of essentially switching off your phone, isn't it? It's making sure you don't get WhatsApp messages or text messages or phone calls, unless obviously they're very important. So if you can do that, if there's a way that you can just cut out those distractions, that can also just make it easier to get into the flow state where the editor disappears as well. And there's also something called the Pomodoro technique, which you may have come across. I think Pomodoro means tomato in Italian or something like that. I did know what it's got to do with tomatoes, but I can't remember now.
Oh, it's a
Anyway,
tomato-shaped timer.
yes, the tomato is tomato. I wasn't expecting that then, Martin, but I just jumped. Yeah, you're right. You're right. The timer is tomato shaped. Anyway, the Pomodoro technique is basically you say I think it's for 20 minutes you are going to do nothing else but the thing that you're engaged in. So with us, of course, it's writing. So you write for 20 minutes, and after 20 minutes, the timer goes off, and you can stop, and you have a 5-minute break, and then it's another 20 minutes. And I think there are different ways of doing it, but some people will do 3 or 4 of those 20-minute bursts with 5-minute breaks, and then they're allowed a 15-minute break. And again, I find that beneficial because I can tell myself much more easily, I'm just going to write without editing for 20 minutes. And then after 20 minutes, I can have a break. And then I can edit if I want. I can then edit for 20 minutes. But it's just a way of dividing the time up, so you're very clear about whether you're editing or writing. And the last one, which many of you may do anyway, and I think it's probably the easiest of all these techniques of trying to stop yourself from editing as you go, is actually is handwriting, is writing in longhand. I find that very helpful because you can't go back and delete a word or cut and paste this line from the beginning of the paragraph and move it to the end of the paragraph or whatever. You just can't, because your handwriting, it's pen and ink, or rather it's pen and paper. So the nearest I get to editing when I'm handwriting is I'll occasionally draw a circle around a line, say, and then do an arrow, meaning even as I'm writing this, I know this should have gone earlier. Or I might write, but it's much easier to just keep the flow, I think, when you're handwriting and you haven't got that temptation, because you haven't got the ability to delete, to cut, to edit, to paste. So at a very kind of basic level, if this is something you struggle with, just getting the words down, I would just say handwrite them and give yourself permission to handwrite badly, to write bad words, to write, to rush through a draft, because you might find that when you read it back the next day or the next week or whatever, then 95% of what you wrote isn't very good and needs a lot of polishing. But I think you're more likely to find that the 5% will contain something you probably, or you may well not have come up with had you been trying to edit and write at the same time, had you been basically working with one foot on the brake and one foot on the accelerator. So that's my advice really, is to do whatever it takes to decide whether you're doing a session of writing or a session of editing, and then do whatever it takes to stay in one or the other. And it's easier to stay in editing than it is in writing, because the temptation is always there to edit. So anyway, so that's my talk. There's much more, hopefully, on my Substack newsletter, as I said, and do join in with the experiment to see, hopefully, my goal with the experiment anyway is to give you an idea of what this means in practice, what I mean by bad writing, what I mean by unedited. So we'll see how it goes. So I think if anyone has any questions, I would love to try and answer them.
Great, thank you so much, Steve. If you have any questions, do pop them in the text chat box. I'll read them out, but it will take usually a minute or so for them to come in. There's a bit of a delay on this. But while we do wait for that, Steve, I'm sure people will be interested to know whether you have any sort of routines that you do to get yourself into that sort of writing mode. I know some writers will go for a run before, some will listen to some music or brew a cup of coffee. Is there any sort of thing that helps just trigger you into
Yeah.
that state?
I don't go for a run. If I stood up and you saw my physique, you would probably be able to tell I don't go for a run before writing. I think, yeah, one thing actually is quite a good point, actually. It took me a while to realise when I'm at my most creative. Um, and I find for me, it's first thing in the morning, which I'm quite disappointed about because I'm not really a morning person. So it was quite a surprise when I discovered this because in many ways my energy levels aren't very high in the morning. But I do think that probably means my inner editor is still half asleep and it's easier to conquer and to shout down the bit of my brain that's trying to analyze and edit because it's still half asleep. And I think we've probably all experienced that kind of when you are still when you're sleepy or just coming round. For me anyway, it feels like a very creative time. It feels like a very fertile time. So for me, yeah, I know I'm at my most creative in the mornings, and I know, so I leave the afternoon for admin and more less creative stuff, shall we say? It doesn't mean that I'm not. I'm by no means advocating all of everyone out there should be a morning writer, but what I am saying is try and decide, try and look at your own practice and your own life and your own energy levels and find out when might be your most productive time. And yeah, there are some kind of routines. I tend to always light a scented candle, and
Okay.
I don't think it's anything about anything really other than this is my routine. I survive on coffee, so obviously I make a cup of coffee. Who wouldn't? But yeah, so yeah, once I'm sort of like about to start a writing session, I'll go downstairs, make myself a cup of coffee, then come up and often light a scented candle. I think it's just something about um, it's just a way you're signaling to your brain, to your body, to your mind that this is what you're about to do. So yeah, whatever. Again, I'm not advocating necessarily making a cup of coffee and lighting a scented candle, but whatever routine seems to get you into the zone or into the right frame of mind to the creative work, I think is important to kind of just to stick with.
Yeah, with the with candles and stuff, it does sound a bit woo woo from the outside, but it's such a powerful thing.
Yeah,
It's that whole thing that Bruce wrote about. It can send you somewhere. You can't put your finger on it, but it affects your
yeah.
brain chemistry in a way that just really can set you
I
off.
think it's. I think yeah. I think especially when you work from home as I do. I don't have a commute that signals to my brain that I'm okay. I'm going to work now. I suppose my commute is walking up the stairs, but that's not much of a commute. But I think so. Whatever other way you've got of just having a routine, it just feels very easy to get to that place where you're about to create.
Okay, a few people have been asking about Steve's Substack. There's a link in the video description. If you sort of expand that, you'll find a link to his Substack there. Okay, there have been a lot of variations of this one, but I'll bring this one from Pragati. At what point should you get a second opinion on a draft? So I guess for you, what is the earliest you might share it, your writing?
Well, I think it depends on who you're going to share it with, which is probably a whole other 45-minute talk in itself. Um, I think there are a couple of things to consider here, and I think one of them is I find ideas can be quite a draft feels quite fragile to me. Like there are certain times at which I know if I was to share or even talk about an idea I've had or a story I'm writing, and someone is less than enthusiastic, I it feels like that might make me feel less enthusiastic or less less sure of it. So I think you have to be reasonably sure of what you're doing before you show anybody at all. um, but that also depends on who you're showing in terms of how much you trust them. I think if you're lucky enough to be a member of a writing group and it's with a group of people you trust, then you can show them a fairly early draft. if you're talking about showing a potential agent or editor, I think then you need to wait until it's as good as you can get it. So I think it depends on what you're showing the person for. If it's someone in the industry you're hoping will one day want to publish you or help you on your route to publication, then I think don't show anyone until you're pretty sure you've taken it as far as you can without someone else's eyes. Whereas if you're just wanting someone to say, yeah, this is working, go for it, or oh, I'm not really sure this is working. Have you thought about this? Then show. It depends who you're showing and for what reason, really. I don't know if I've answered the question now.
Yeah. Do you
Second opinion on a draft, yeah.
do you ever number your drafts? Like, I guess it can feel like a bit of an amorphous process sometimes. Do you have like
Yeah.
the one, two, my red draft, the green draft?
Well, I did make the classic mistake. It's almost a cliche, but with the first book of like, I ended up having files on my desktop on my computer that were called final draft, final draft. No, really, really final draft, and then. But now, no, I now number them, so they're draft 0, and then 1, and then 1 point. And basically, if I'm just changing things around and not making a massive structural change, I just call it 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. If it's a more structural edit, if it's a more if it feels like it's a new evolution of the book, if you like, I'll call it draft 2. So, I usually have like 0, 1.1, 1.2, 2.1, 2.2, 3.1 sometimes, but we'll see. Yeah.
Here's a related question from Deb, and I guess this is a sort of for you question rather than a definitive one. But is there a difference between editing and rewriting?
Oh, God. Well, I don't know, actually. It's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, I suppose... For me, I suppose rewriting, I would think if I was saying I was rewriting a chapter, say, yeah, I think I would basically be going, okay, I don't think that chapter is quite right. I don't think I've told it in the best way, or I think maybe I've approached it from the wrong angle. So I would call that a rewrite. If I'm actually going, okay, I'm not scrapping it completely, perhaps. Maybe I'll be using some of the the previous draft, but I'm substantially changing it. Whereas editing feels a bit more like it's more or less structurally there. I might be choosing better words, or a slightly different image. So maybe editing for me anyway is a little bit more nuts and bolts, whereas rewriting is more structural, perhaps.
I guess in some ways it can be a tricking your mind kind of thing as well. Like calling something a rewrite feels like a hell of a lot of work ahead of you.
Yeah, absolutely, it does. Yeah. So yeah, tell yourself you're editing.
Okay, we have a question here from Mindpath Media. How can you maintain flow if you realise you need to do a load of research partway through draft 0?
You write in square brackets, need to research marine biology, close square brackets. I mean, I'm kind of being flippant, but I think it is true. I think, it depends on what you're writing, obviously, and how much research is needed. I could have, when I wrote Before I Go to Sleep, for example, I could have spent months reading everything there was to read about memory loss and amnesia and neuropsychology and the structure of the brain and blah, blah, blah. I didn't. I read some of that stuff to give me an idea and, so I knew I was on the right lines. But then, if, for example, I had a scene in which Dr. Nash was talking about something to do with my main character's brain, I would just put square brackets, find out something to do with brain stuff. and then it really is about just pushing on as quickly as you can. So yeah, I would just write a square bracket and go science stuff here.
Yeah. Thank God for the whatever device. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we have some more questions here. Well, someone wants to know, this is a quick one, what scent is the candle?
Oh, it varies. I like woody things, and there's something called opoponax, which is one of my favourites. I don't even know
Oh.
if I pronounced that properly, but yeah. But it varies. Depends what I've got in the cupboard. I
Um,
do like my fragrances, so yeah, I usually have a selection.
that means it's easy to shop for you, like for birthdays and Christmases.
Yeah, well, no, because I'm also quite fussy about it. Like, so there are certain smells I'm like, no, I don't like that. I mean, I would never say that. Of course, I wouldn't. I would go, oh no, it's lovely, and then it's just still be in the cupboard 5 years later.
Kimberly asks, but what do you do when you don't know where your book is going? It's hard to outline when you don't write genre fiction. Oof, shots fired. But I guess there is a
Yeah,
difference between sort of having an outline, as opposed to discovery writers without that sort of plan. Like, I guess this sort of flow state can go on, indeterminably.
well, yeah. I mean, I suppose in many ways it's perhaps even more important then to just push on and not try and edit as you go, because I think with books that aren't genre fiction or aren't, I suppose what we're really saying is aren't necessarily that plot heavy. I think you have to be, for me anyway, because I think you have to be even more willing to explore your character by writing them. So almost seeing where the book or the character or the story wants to lead you and following it rather than actually trying to control it too much, which I think you can only do by switching off your inner editor. So in many ways, it's possibly even more important then to just kind of go with the flow, if you'll excuse the pun, and see where the work takes you. Um,
We've got a question here that I've been sitting on for a little bit. Oh God, I've lost it now. From Miran, how do you get? Oh, great avatar. How do you get over the fear of putting in placeholder text when you're blocked on a bit? I have this morbid fear that if I can't solve it right now, I'll never solve it.
um, well, I completely sympathise because I have the same thing of like, oh, this there is no solution, but there is, and there always will be. Um, I think really when I hit a block and I think I don't know how to sort this out, really what I'm saying is there is a way, but I'm scared that it might be involve a huge rewrite. There's always, especially when we're writing fiction, we're making it up. Well, I assume
Mm.
you're writing fiction and making it up, so we can change anything. And so when I get scared about how I can fix this plot hole or this problem or this, really what I'm scared about is it might involve a lot of work, um, which I don't want to do. So I think it's just having faith that you will fix it, because I can't think of a single time when there is literally something has not been fixable in some way. Um, but I think it's even more important in a way to at that point stop, and sorry, to not stop, to put your placeholder text and to push on, because the solution will come to you probably when you're, you know, knitting or walking the dog or whatever you do in your, whatever your hobbies are, when you're ice skating, whatever it might be, that's when you think, oh yeah, that's how the character can sort this out, or that's how I can get from A to B. It will come to you. Just having faith. That's the best answer I can give. I'm afraid there is no
Yeah.
magic.
We've I've got a few here. We're just going to try and do a semi-rapid fire one set of ones. This is from Glenda asking, what ratio of time do you give to writing and editing? I suppose this is across the span of working on a project.
Yeah, gosh, that's an interesting one. It's probably I've never sat and worked it out. It's probably 40-60, I would say, at least. At least 40% of my time is sorry. At least 60% of my time is editing. So it might even be more like 30-70. So the first draft is relatively it's a relatively small part of the project, and it is in the editing and the rewriting of it that it starts to come together. In fact, it's probably nearer 20-80 actually. Thinking about it, it's probably nearer 20-80. So
Uh,
20% of my writing.
Georgia asks, is there anything that comes before the draft zero with regards to the planning stage? I guess maybe I'll rephrase this. Like, when you plan to write your draft zero, what do your notes look like? what outline, what plan do you have in front of you?
I have a lot of like spider diagrams and character notes, and just I've got notepads full of ideas I've had that sometimes contradict each other. Um, and the last project I kind of wrote almost like a treatment, if that makes sense. So almost like a treatment for a film or TV series in which I try to imagine I was writing a document that would explain this story, explain the book I was about to write to somebody else, and I found that very helpful because it was only 3 pages long, but it meant I'd sorted out a lot of the things that I often did delay sorting out because they don't feel very much fun. So I have had some thoughts. I know where I've plotted my route basically, but I like to leave myself time, space to take detours and for the work to surprise me. So I wouldn't call that a draft zero though, because I'm not trying to write. There's no dialogue in that. There's no description in it. There's no, it's just action and plot basically.
Let's see. There's a question here. Oh, this is sort of, you can answer this. When your novel went from book to the silver screen, do you or do authors in general become involved in the screenplay?
I didn't. Beyond, I was shown a draft and asked for my opinion. Um, but other than that, no, I didn't. I wasn't involved. I didn't want to be. I mean, some people obviously write their own script, and so there's a huge variation. But most authors I know hand the project over essentially, and some people don't even get shown a draft. I mean, I was lucky that the Rowan who made the film, Rowan and Liza, who were the writer, director, and producer respectively, were very keen for my opinion to be taken on board and for me to be involved in that way. So they showed me drafts, but no, I didn't get involved in any more than that. But it varies hugely. I mean, some people, are on board as the writer themselves, and they write the script for their own work or the screenplay for their own work.
Okay, I think we've got one more. Let's see. There's someone who kept asking the same question. Maybe. Well, Denny Robert Thompson keeps asking about writing the introduction to a book. By what I've seen, like you're writing a novel based on your parents who are in MI5. You keep talking about the introduction and when you should write it and the importance of it. And, like novels don't tend to have introductions. I guess you may be thinking that you want to add some context to how this relates to your life. If anything, that tends to turn up in the acknowledgements at the end. But in terms of novels don't tend to have a sort of out of world introduction in a sense, right?
No, exactly. That's my experience. I mean, some of them, the nearest, I suppose, well, actually, no. I was going to say the nearest is the prologue, but a prologue isn't an introduction either, really, is it?
No.
Um, no, but I mean, with non-fiction anyway. Whenever I write non-fiction, my introduction is always the last thing that I write because I can only introduce something when I know what I'm introducing.
Yeah.
So if that advice helps in any way, that last I would say. But yeah, novels don't tend to have introductions. You're right.
Okay. And that brings us to the end of the hour. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in and following along this time. If you haven't given us a thumbs up already, please do. And of course, remember to sign up to Steve's Substack to follow along with the experiment. Links in the video description below. Steve, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I hope we can have you back on again.
Thank you.
Any last words for the folks at home?
Good luck. Enjoy it. Switch off that inner editor and just write.
Got it. Thanks, everyone. See you later. Bye.
Thank you very much. Cheers.